Collection Research section. I'd like to begin by acknowledging Australia's First Nations peoples as the traditional owners and custodians of this land, and give my respect to the elders past and present, and through them to all Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Thank you for attending this event, coming to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. This evening's presentation, Enaction Plan, Reassembling the Past, is by 2025 Creative Arts Fellow, Dr. Julie Gough. Julie is an artist, writer and curator at the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery. Julie's multimedia artworks reveal and represent conflicting and subsumed histories and the legacies and impacts of colonisation, sometimes referring to her family's experiences as Tasmanian Aboriginal people. Julie has exhibited in more than 200 exhibitions since 1994. Our Creative Arts Fellowships program supports researchers to make intensive use of the National Library's rich collections through residencies of 4 weeks. Fellowships offered by the Library are only made possible by generous philanthropic support, and Julie's fellowship has been supported by the Ray Matthew and Eva Colesman Trust. Tonight's presentation, Enaction Plan, is a parallel process of mapping the pathway of utilising the collections of the National Library of Australia to strategically seek and resurface material aspects of the colonial past most impactful on Tasmanian Aboriginal people, whilst developing artwork responses to this journey to access and reconstruct history. Please join me in welcoming Julie Gough.
Thanks very much. I'll move this one here. Oh, excited. Okay, got the tech and the microphone. So yes, I'd like to firstly pay my respects to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, on whose country I've been fortunate to visit on various occasions and stay in November, December on their lands, and also now for this brief trip back to present. Also a big hello to Carol and Wilfred out there. So to start, my month-long fellowship ran from November the 10th to December the 5th, and it was very compressed 4 weeks, from which I requested 162 items, viewing at a steady rate of 6 to 7 per day. Oh, that was my start slide. Oh, wait, next one. Okay. I took 2,900 photographs, plus received, as part of the fellowship allowance, quality images, some of which feature in this presentation, with captions, unlike my own images, here as yet uncaptioned. I enjoyed good food, plus desperate after-hour snacks to fortify myself for facing often difficult objects and subjects. So just here now a warning in terms of some of the content that follows is disturbing and should be disturbing, considering the period in particular I'm looking at, which is the first 5 decades of the 1800s. And it shows portraiture of people deceased ancestors as well. So I'll walk us through some key ideas, thoughts and findings to date via mostly images from the special collections here at the National Library, sourced during this fellowship. And bear with me, for this might appear a show and tell and a bit disjointed, but this is the stage of the project for assembling scattered thoughts and evolving questions, mostly about how to advocate and or assist modes of greater connectivity to be developed and instated between items and objects and manuscripts and art in collections within, between and outside these institutions that hold them. So I'll demonstrate how art in particular carries extra meanings, laden even outside the terms and the times that they were made. Plus that's something that's produced that a maker, author, doesn't necessarily realise what was impacting on them, and that their work imparts beyond their conscious efforts. But this extra information is not often evident or accessible to everyone today, outside of discourses in academic subscription platforms. And many archived artworks and texts in the GLAM sector, the gallery, libraries and museum sector, exist as orphans. So I'm suggesting tonight that improving and modifying catalogue systems might currently suggest potential partner items for these, but they're often false leads. My main realisation to date from this project is a pondering for how First Nations and cross-cultural meanings and readings of collection items can be instated in this sector. Within the registration and interpretation options for artworks and manuscript material made in or about Australia, in my instance particularly Lutruwita, Tasmania, and in that first half of the 1800s, these are spread across so many institutions. And notably, very few, if any, special collection-worthy objects rest with Aboriginal people, whether made by Aboriginal or non-Aboriginal people. I'm hoping that a platform exists or could be built to access, plan and ease navigation and augment our histories via these artworks and other collection items, where objects can be mobilised to raise more relational clues and hints to test situations and likelihoods, degrees of separation, and to infill these gaps in our histories, literally remapping the worlds of institutionally bound collections, objects, information and images. Can we work with all our inherent biases to train ourselves to observe more, deeper and differently, to share information and configure new systems to refamiliarise ourselves with our histories of coexistence? Even if those times were dark and forgetting much might have been the better option at the time. And so many pictures are mute, unavoidably contextually silenced by being held offshore away from Tasmania, and assembling a conglomeration of these across institutions, virtually regenerating their original homelands, mapping their associated people, time and place, Aboriginal and not, could recover lost ground and generate next steps. But how to start? Working from and with place makes the most sense. Mapping, a process for reconstituting and denoting actual or even just plausible connections. Those engaging with these systems can start or step off from people, place or story, event, to those neighbouring to follow and form threads that ultimately move beyond how those in power have manipulated and managed what is registered as legitimate history. And despite much absencing, what remains, including apparently benign landscape paintings, carry the traces of time and events they were made in. Updated retellings can include broader context, broaching these gaps and differences between what people knowingly or unconsciously have transmitted through their words and their art. When Charles Edward Stanley visited Putalina Oyster Cove south of Hobart between the end of 1847 and 1849 when he died in Hobart, he made at least 3 watercolours portraying some residents, our old people, who had been sent there in October 1847 when Waibalena Aboriginal establishment on Flinders Island was shut down. These include Macamay, who'd been carefully renamed Washington after he and 2 other Aboriginal men killed 2 white men at Port Sorell in northern Tasmania. One man was the brother of the treasurer of Van Diemen's Land, the second an overseer, James Parker, charged by his co-workers multiple times for brutality in the year and up to the week before his death. There is much more to unearth about this episode, including how 3 Aboriginal men were facilitated to survive, hidden in plain sight, and not tell their story. John Clark, the son of William Clark, who established Cluny Park near Bothwell, was the magistrate charged with locating the bodies of Parker and Thomas in 1831. It's a bit hard to read, so this is correspondence from William Clark at Cluny to Governor Arthur, explaining what he wanted in terms of support to remove the presence of Aboriginal people on that estate. Charles Edward Stanley lived with Governor Denison and his family for 2 years before he passed away, and most of his artworks, given this date range, might appear not of interest to Aboriginal people. These were made when many of our ancestors were living offshore in Bass Strait, although mine by then were living between Perth, Dunollen and Latrobe in northern Tasmania. But Stanley's works, even those not depicting Aboriginal people, somehow resurface our Aboriginal histories. These places he sat and he sketched connect directly to us and our people and stories, some surely even recounted to him by colonists that he met and stayed with. At Dr. Grant's house, Tulloch-Gorham, Stanley might have been shown this sketch made by Dr. Grant of Warrady, a chief who passed in 1842 and likely visited Grant a decade before his death, some 15 years before Stanley called past. At Killymoon Estate, the same stories and evidence of past Aboriginal occupation and encounters still today resonate along that entire Fingal Valley. So place by place, colonist by colonist, Stanley painted what looks like afflicted and haunted grounds across our island. At Oyster Cove, he painted and carefully named those portraits of Aboriginal people. By then, no doubt, his head was spinning with tales about violent frontier Aborigines from those visits to colonists island-wide. But at Oyster Cove, Stanley was faced by family groups, toddlers to elders, evidently modelling for his representation, welcoming him in their bright garb. And Stanley's works reveal what I'm arguing here as much as the others, that art is rarely only a picture, but holds more and different from the artist's experience of the occasion. Stanley's archive facilitates recovery in all senses of the word. He met us and went to our places from where we had been banished. He depicted so many places, surely inspired and informed by recounts of their local histories. So Stanley is one in this presentation tonight who seems unique, though, in registering and amassing so many sites as objects of memory. And to me, these seem gifts to us of very mindful, sombre journeys. So every artwork of an estate with its pseudo-mansion was tainted by the work done to establish and occupy those grounds. So the Talbot family of Malahide, which is at the other end of the Fingal Valley just mentioned. Talbot's men were known, his workmen were known for raiding Aboriginal camps and also abducting children. And one of those children, as best can be ascertained through archival detective work, was painted herself in silhouette that's now held in the Archive of South Australia and denoted, inscribed Black Peg. This is a bit of an aside, but it's the kind of the means of returning art to country and to reawaken the possibilities of the connections that are otherwise practically lost to us. And through these actions of return, I believe that a contemporary population can also reconnect and face together. So at this point, when taking this copy of an artwork to Douglas Park, where this child was taken after leaving the Talbots' residence, post 2 years residence, I was standing there the day that I managed to place this portrait of her and a car pulled up and a group of teenagers who, some of whom lived on this estate now, and I shared the story of this girl, of which they were unaware that she had lived where they do now until she was banished again to Flinders Island. So concurrently with many of the earlier colonial works, dozens of volumes commenced publication instructing how to immigrate to Van Diemen's Land. These escalated in number from 1818. They outlined how immigration was to proceed and how to prepare, and colonists were advised to bring their Indian servants and how they would still encounter Bengal cattle and Oriental chickens and exotic merchandise that filled Hobart Town stores. For some, returning to Great Britain wasn't an option, particularly for 75,000 odd transportees arriving across 5 decades into the social experiment that was Van Diemen's Land. Their British culture hybridised and toughened to stay the course on our island. By the 1820s, Aboriginal presence was already actively erased from the story of the island. Perceived externally, our ancestors were deemed no threat, inoffensive, etc. But by the end of the decade, new arrivals realised that Aboriginal people were not as negligible or invisible as those published guides promised. Only from the 1870s were entire books published about Tasmanian Aboriginal people in English by James Bonwick, Henry Ling Roth, Clive Turnbull, Vivian Ray Ellis later, and particularly the published papers of George Augustus Robinson through the transcription work of N.J.B. Plomley. But colonists corresponded to the government, and those letters alongside newspaper articles tell an entirely different story. The media incited panic through the print press. Colonists insisted they needed military forces stationed across the island in towns and on private properties for their protection. I've questioned over the years what influenced and informed this very particular map's design. Last year I asked a map librarian in the British Library this question, and he replied, "We don't do your research for you." However, fortunately, Peter Stanley did assist with this on my National Library visit. He kindly provided references and direction to consider the progenitors of this map. I learnt it closely resembles the map series of the Peninsular War Battles, 1808 to 14, published in 1838 by Wild. Major Thomas Mitchell was Surveyor General of New South Wales from 1827, and it's likeliest that his long production work on these Peninsular War battle maps, in league with this, his published guide on surveying, was what guided George Franklin in the production of his map. George Franklin and his Indian placement prior to Van Diemen's Land had set me thinking that his experiences and insights from being in India would have impacted on his Van Diemen's Land perceptions and output. As with other colonists from elsewhere in Empire who produced useful works about their relocations to Van Diemen's Land. Hence, I'd suspect the black line map originated from something he made or saw in India, but being informed about the Peninsular War Map series laid this to rest. But meanwhile, the significance of the equally uncanny proclamation panels, one of which resides here in the library, also either made or at least suggested by Franklin, were concurrently produced. 8 survive internationally, and more work is needed on their backstory, but at this point their resemblance to Indian scroll art seems like a likely visual influence in these panels' construction and appearance, albeit here via oils on Huon pine. Oh, that's the correspondence from Franklin to Governor Arthur, suggesting that hieroglyphics are the means to communicate with Tasmanian Aboriginal people. So the military map is useful ground. It reveals the state of the colony in 1830 and delineates the undeniability of the purposeful loss of country from its original people and vice versa. The colonists were ready and invested after 3 decades to banish the surviving circa 300 Tasmanian Aboriginal people to offshore detention through this military campaign. And this map reveals not only the movement of the military, but names 325 landholders largely responsible for inciting this campaign alongside other hunting action over the previous decade. The overlap of the military map with the locations of newcomers granted land provides a lasting window into the cold-hearted perversity of empire. The dual naming of the colonists by dot marks alongside marked manoeuvres to capture and expel the actual people of a country is normalised here. And these are still the surnames ranging across our island, some allies, others amnesiacs. So maps are objects, undeniably explicating the mindset and the modelling of those in power. Maps from empire terrorise, recast lands and waterways with new names from other continents, overlaid with origin stories from British counties. And this work rendered the alien familiar, largely to spook immigration. By the 1900s, landholders' surnames were replaced on Tasmanian Land Department maps with property names, but now these too have been removed from the latest series of maps. So, yeah. So those still have the property names, but not since. Removing the names, both people and property, from maps conceals the past, much in the way that colonial artworks and ancestral objects dim when out of context. They are always less accessible away from their homelands. Without backstories or local knowledge, they disconnect, lost from other works and excised from their part in an artist or a commissioner's life or intention for that artwork. And people new to Tasmanian Lands Department maps won't realise how much has been erased across the 1800s to the 1900s and now the 2000s that affects the work of history, the study of history, disables that work of correlation. Violence is embedded in the landscape of Lutruwita, Tasmania. Artists traipsed or rode for days to reach some haunts and homesteads. That's a bit small, sorry. On the right page, second entry describes John Batman, one of the paintings of John Batman's lookout, and Glover himself described it as where he planned his attacks on Tasmanian Aboriginal people. Yeah, I'm trying to read it, sorry. So, yeah, Batman's lookout, named on account of Mr. Batman frequenting this spot to entrap the natives. And from military expeditions and stockkeeper attacks and roving parties, by night on Aboriginal camps, Aboriginal children were so-called found in the woods, found by a river, and more than 100 were taken, and sometimes more than one at a time. And placeholders for potential massacre sites and dates can be tentatively plotted by where stolen Aboriginal children surface for baptism. Or to live with which families, where and when they were last recorded alive. Another sketch by Charles Edward Stanley of the estate Mona Vale. For whenever I hear the name Mona Vale, which is private property, trespassers arrested, all I think of is this boy taken by the then owner Commode to England. And when he came back, he soon after died, this young boy. And now to the problematics of artworks about us. And some of them, well, they're just plain awful renditions. Or fantasy fixations, mournful, nostalgic, unhelpful, representations that work to smooth the dying pillow in the eyes of the colonists, rather than works that assisted with the rights and the recognition of our ancestors for what they worked towards, of those who lived as warriors, but they were also fathers, brothers, sons, sisters, mothers, daughters, not merely singular portraits labelled as leaders, negotiators, vanquished. These collected portraits are often arrayed in major galleries like captives or trophies of war. Kidnapped. These portraits and also the landscapes showing our ancestors capering about are deployed in institutional exhibits as punctums, full stops, immutable, the end of us. This slide migrated from the earlier part about Indian immigration. I was wondering where it went to. Sorry, there is. Okay. So these works form a closed circuit and they take up the limited airspace designated for us in our history in GLAM spaces, the gallery, library, museum spaces. And they're not really about us or for us, but they disingenuously sneak in to do that work and to take our space. They set up a binary that we're drawn into and that we can't easily test or articulate differently than is expected by the mainstream. We're bound to these works as those only for legitimate Aboriginal interests and response. Five-pence pamphlets survive in very few collections, delineating the coda for the Burford panoramas. Massive paintings, most made after preliminary works, made by Augustus Earle on his world travels in the 1820s. They are also maps, laying foundation colonising stories for various places, such as the Bay of Islands, or Aotearoa, Sydney, or Hobart Town. If the Hobart panorama was drawn up and sketched by Augustus Earle, it was produced during his 5-month stay in Van Diemen's Land in 1825 and staged in London 7 years later. Martial law was enacted in 1828 against Tasmanian Aboriginal people 3 years after Earle departed. So why does this panorama at this early date only depict a tiny Aboriginal group hiding behind a bush on the far right, in contrast to the First Peoples of Sydney, Bungaree named people-centred and active? Apologies, there's no close-up, but it's, can you see there's the just slipping off bottom right. That's all that is shown of us. And both contrast greatly against Burford's Bay of Islands panorama. Maori presence, people and cultural attributes writ so very large across this landscape. By the mid-1820s, Tasmanian Aboriginal people were increasingly depicted as inconsequential, or in the case of artworks attributed to Joseph Lycett, absent. The narrative of doomed and disappearing had longevity, engineered so by the 1830s. In Burford's Hobart Town panorama, for example, these natives were no longer troublesome, and this billboard of its time operated clearly as an invitation to immigrate. The Hobart Town panorama sits with the map of the military operations against the Aboriginal inhabitants of Van Diemen's Land and the proclamation panel to demonstrate now that the grand genocidal project at work upon my ancestors was proceeding as planned. The sheer number of increasing arrivals seals this reading. These objects log what was done in record time. To counter post-1830s absencing of Tasmanian Aboriginal people from mainstream publications and landscape art, we can instead question and augment the hallowed storylines of those many landscape works catalogued around our absence. Aboriginal interpretations remain uninvited because we and our ancestors are apparently not in them. But these are all significant markers of our ancestors, including their dispossession and death, and the resounding subsequent mainstream silence. But these are also our story, as well as these places. The artists, the commissioners, the donors of these works might hold something significant to Aboriginal histories. The pastoral scapes, the mansions, the crops, and the topographies from which our ancestors were absenced, needs First People to undertake the work of research, redress and reclamation, including within these glam spaces that hold the material in question. We can direct new modes of registration, encounter and exhibition. Towards cooperative cataloguing systems and growing those trails leading to and between people and collections across the libraries, museums and galleries. Depictions of place and this country is inherently also of significance and connection to us. It is also our cultural material, our memory, our story. Art is political. In mobilising collections and guiding cataloguing system updates, connectivity back and forth and overseas too can further seek what is held elsewhere in diaries, correspondence, and even find lost objects of culture. Provenance is genealogy, that recombines people with their stories. Donors or past owners are significant to First Peoples because they lead back to the rub, the unfolding onset of the grand catastrophe for Aboriginal people. I've got to slow down. Okay. I've got a little bit of a migration situation again with a slide. In generations past, it seemed all GLAM institutions seemed to have had or held one or two Anglo-seers, people who worked there for decades, mindfully absorbing the genealogies and the scandals and the machinations of colonial families since their arrival from the homeland, Britain. And by association, these same people knew those families' connections, loose term, with Aboriginal people. Now, new ways are needed to redress knowledge imbalances, participation, access and interpretation. That includes the reality, beginning and since, of the occupation of this continent and the non-bucolic bones on which landscape art was and is produced. The status quo is managed and maintained by those in power by actively diverting attention from oppositional histories or enabling reconnections with the cause and effect of colonisation. And databases still seem bereft of those difficult layers and stories of interconnection. This is Bole Lodge, which is about 1 kilometre from where I'm living. And it was built by the Emmett family, and Henry James Emmett's own accounts, handwritten, are held in this institution, manuscript 3311, on his experiences of the Black Line military campaign. And he describes in detail what occurred between Aboriginal people and colonists, but also in the general mess that was the campaign itself. And he later describes living up in the far northwest of Lutruwita, Tasmania, and speaking with locals who recounted how well, for example, women had been throwing spears at colonists, managing to knock off their hats while they were riding past on horseback. So somewhere inside all of these accounts, and sometimes only one-line recounts from one local colonist's grandchild, is this truth that I seek that is still plausibly to be refound across our island if our residents are aware of these artwork prompts that exist often far away from our own shores. To fill gaps and find the missing, all the associations, people, places await data entry so that these objects return to networks as they once did and not existing singly in isolation. So one of my main take-homes from this fellowship stay has been a renewed belief that truth-telling must increase nationally, but that this label may be complicating what should already be regular processes of seeking and adding missing information from all perspectives and leaving space to future add what has not yet resurfaced. First Peoples need more access and information to rebuild archives, log our interest and notations into those existing, as well as construct our own. These are artworks of our places, even after being confiscated and modified by homesteads and orchards. And they remind us of where we lived and what has happened. And they can counter the national amnesia around invasion and halt ignorant celebrations of occupation. If our varied meanings and readings exist across these repositories, then art can truly work as a useful vehicle to evoke and transmit histories otherwise not broached. These are not just pictures, they're windows, portals, prompts, reminders, clues, and promises. These artworks are unbound, open-ended and invitational to responses and augmentations, more fluid than written texts. They can reunite information and bring into connection. Clues can then arise for where, with whom else, to search for material, including that which we didn't realise was missing. Creating an online site of examples in process. Basically, this presentation is a step to demonstrate how to register and recognise the depths of this island story, residing even in unexpected material. Artworks of our haunted country, combined with First Peoples' insights, will reassemble complex cross-cultural storylines outside and beyond simple Western art history readings. Thank you. Whoops.
Thank you so much, Julie. We now have some time for questions. As the presentation is being live streamed, please wait for the microphone to reach you before asking your question.
Okay. Thank you. It's very fast.
Hi. Given the strong focus that you've given on the context in which images are created and the dislocation of images from that original context, I was wondering about with the images that you've gotten through the Copies Direct service. I've noticed many of them you haven't cropped out the artifacts from capture. I was wondering if there was any intention behind that.
I was asked that earlier when, whether it was a mistake when it was, and I think I'm letting my artist self seep through in that decision possibly, but also I think it's just, there's different means by which these images have been obtained. So you can see my phone photographs, and then, yeah, the allowance for images within the fellowship is incredibly valuable because you get something of great resolution that you can zoom into, you know, and those are the ones that arrive with this calibration that I find interesting anyway, to just ponder how much, so when I showed the map, I mean, not the map, the New Norfolk new road being built, and I shared that this is how it arrived at this quite small thing in a plastic sleeve, you know, and yet when it's, without that, if I just show only the image provided to me at great scale, you get a completely different reading of the object as an object. The other thing is when I remembered in a way to request the back of the proclamation panel image, and I just thought, I really think that when people request images, they should automatically get the back and the front of everything. I'm really, not have, so I'm just interested in how much we don't even think to ask in life, including where's the back of this, so I'm just wondering about the back of all of the works.
If there's something on the back, we provide the back.
Well, a notation of the back is not the back, though. But yes, it's a clue. Well, that's what I was noticing, how useful the notes are. You know, the Killy Moon reference. Because I remember at the National Gallery, when you look at the largest Tutero works, or years back when I looked at the labels, it denoted that at least one of the portraits had resided in Killy Moon as well. And then I found online from a really antiquated image of one or both above the fireplace at Killy Moon, which then explained to me why the one in the National Gallery had to be extensively conserved, because it was full of cracks from the heat of the fire. And then I was thinking, oh, I wish the cracks hadn't been conserved, and you just saw this entirely crazed portrait that showed the state of its being over that fireplace in a valley full of massacre, you know. So it's hard to undo things that are done.
Hi. Julie, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but having looked across a lot of the images of First Nations people across, well, basically Australia, photography seems to have been a game changer, because when it arrived, it sort of put all the previous images, whether realistic or unrealistic, in a different place, in a drawer, but then the images seem to disappear, except for photography. The artwork's like, whoosh, gone. Is that perception accurate to your thinking?
So we're in a different state in every way, Tasmania. So photography, there's an anomalous several photographs of which one survive as a daguerreotype from the late 1840s, but of 3 Aboriginal people, but otherwise it's 1858 at Oyster Cove that people begin to be, to my knowledge, I should have put a fallibility clause that everything I've said tonight could be wrong, but including artwork details. But we didn't. So many of our ancestors we only have through, if at all, through those that were experiencing the colonial violence in that way were only through, particularly Thomas Bock, but also John Skinner Prout on Flinders Island and his amazing work. So but because they're not photographs, I feel that there's this sense institutionally that they are art and can be treated as art rather than our ancestors. So maybe there's that remove that is problematic, more problematic in a way.
Julie, I've got an online question for you. They've asked, what surprised you in engaging with the collections and archives at the library the most? Was there a surprise? There was... mostly I was feeling this sense that there was too much and not enough time. So there was... because I'm looking for things I haven't seen, and because you sort of start with what you know, then you realise you're running out of time and you've been looking at things you already are aware of, and then you're like, I don't actually know how to find things I don't know are in here. And that's still this kind of thing I have of what's there that I don't, or someone hasn't alerted me to. How do you really find that? And generally they're not artworks, they're manuscript material or, that type of finding to be found. So did I have a surprise? In the collections, really. I was a bit surprised by how many, and very fortunately held here, there were these immigration and travel guides. And every time I was looking and reading how they were describing Aboriginal people, but also just the intent, the expectation, the blatant worse than disregard for us. You know, it is that the stomach-turning sense of reading those was surprisingly probably the most powerful. You know, how that was being churned out regularly, new additions, encouraging the immigration.
Hi, Julie. Thanks for the talk. I work for the Northern Land Council in the cartography department, and I work with a lot of anthropologists to kind of dig apart a lot of these colonial records, many of which we convert into maps that go to the court to decide on land claims. I was wondering, in your fellowship, did you ever come across any records of like clan group names or dreaming sites or anything in regards to that?
So for our island, there's 2 copies of a map, but neither are held here, that are, I think, very useful and significant, or could be, which are by Henry Hallier of the Van Diemen's Land Company, who he took his own life, and it, to me, appears partly in response to the horrors that Aboriginal people were experiencing, but that's a personal reading of what he saw, and I don't think participated in the northwest of our island. So 2 copies of his map of the northwest of the island are the only ones I've found that really denote Aboriginal presence. So one place he has called Womra's hunting ground, and there's others where he, and other Warra Tir, so others are language expressions of encounter that he's named various landscape markers by Aboriginal language, and others that are kind of cryptically referring to crows, for example, which colonists at that time and later did name our ancestors as crows. When describing how many of us they'd killed, they would discuss how many crows they'd killed that day. So I think his maps are really significant. And also, but what I think also has been not fully understood is that some Aboriginal people and families remained on mainland Tasmania and were never off island, and therefore I question whether what was applied to Tasmania in terms of lost connection to country should ever have applied. But I don't know if any of that can be legally revisited. I want to say not lost connection, but in terms of what the West understands as lost connection to country, which is not what I understand in any case. Yeah, sorry there.
Hello, Julie.
Hi.
My name's Latalia. I'm an artist as well, so I'm super excited to hear you talk. I'm a descendant of my great-grandfather who had a farm in Tasmania. So I'm someone who's just learned to deal with the generational trauma that was passed down through that family. So I'm getting my courage to go back to Tasmania and find that property and do some artwork to find my own story. But I wanted to approach that in the most respectful way that I could, hence why I'm here today. So I wondered whether some of the silence that has happened for Tasmania particularly is because there was so much violence on both sides. And for my story, I'm thinking about what happened for women, and I'm wondering whether their letters and their perspectives might shed some light, and that those things would not necessarily be in the institutions. So I just wondered if that had been part of your journey.
It's a pretty good point. So, and are you meaning what happened to Aboriginal women or non-Aboriginal women or both women? Yeah. It's so there's a story of a non-Aboriginal woman called Esther Gough, my surname. There were 2 daughters and a mother, Gough, and the neighbour's wife and they, so because it's my own surname, it's always kind of registered as who are these people. Well, they were attacked while the men were away, these Irish immigrants, and 3 of the 4 died from being speared by Aboriginal people. So generally, anyone that knows all these various accounts of cross-cultural violence and who died and who didn't, I intermittently get asked, am I connected to that family? But one daughter survived and had family who had family who had family, and somehow, some 20 years ago, I managed to find descendants of that child. And I said, I just don't quite understand what happened, but I have a bad feeling, of why they waited to attack the women and children while the men were away. And that descendant had said to me that their family knew that the head of the household had kept an Aboriginal woman chained, and they were aware of that. That isn't anywhere published that I've seen. There's this both sides to any story. And so, in part, that doesn't help, like war has no victors, right? And it's all, but that's really what I question is I think that the maps of the massacres, the violence, all of that needs to be plotted, but also all of any encounters, anyone who's missing, try to get the picture of the cause and the effect as best as we can plotted, even injury, all of that, which sounds also perverse to be describing and discussing such horrible things. But another time I was trying to find places where bad things had happened, and I drove up to a farm gate, and it was no access. Mostly now the gates have all of these images of toxic chemicals being used as the reason for why there's no access, which I find pretty interesting. That I'm like, wow, I'm going to die if I drive to that farmhouse, because of... but there was a phone number on this gate, and I really thought, within a kilometre was a massacre site, from what I'd understood from looking at actually Halia's map that I mentioned, because later maps had erased the name of that place, which was just called, it was a swamp, but it was later gone, so I have my suspicions about what surveyors were getting up to. And I rang the mobile number on the gate, and I said, I'm trying to understand the lay of the land here, and is there any chance I could enter this property? And the guy on the phone said, I'll be back in a minute, and he had just been shopping in the nearest town, and he drove up to me, so my instinct is not to mention Aboriginal anything, or the gate will not be opened, is generally my experience. And so I said, I'm just looking for a place called X Swamp. And he said, yeah. He said, that was drained. And I said, okay. I said, where is that? And he said, I was just there behind those line of trees. And he said, the Aborigines used to camp there. And I was like, wow, he's actually telling me something, and I said, yeah, I'm aware. I said, I'm aware that they were also killed there. And he went, oh. But what I haven't mentioned is that he had a very strong Midlands English accent and did not have a multi-generational stake in the story of that place. But he had heard that was the Aboriginal camping place of a swamp that's no longer there. So somewhere in all of this is the means by which to tell those truths.
Hi, Julie. Thanks very, very much for that talk. I was just, I suppose, just with the last couple of questions, I suppose just sort of thinking about the whole role of oral histories in this as well, and how do you bring those, especially with the problems with that you've touched on with these very, very sensitive, hidden sort of accounts. How do you bring that together, those oral histories, with the sort of archival record that you've been showing us tonight?
I like my clumsy attempt in producing something in time for today was literally putting them together, and that's what I've done in video art is, reconnection, and it may be clumsy and not successful as visual art or as archive, but somehow we have to bring things together, and probably if they look awkward, that's even better. It's not a very big answer.
Thank you very much for those thoughtful questions. As we draw to a close, some quick plugs before we leave. If you'd like a copy of Julie's latest book, Tense Past, several copies are available tonight, but more are expected tomorrow, so please check in at the bookshop for purchase at the National Library Bookshop. Our website is the place where you'll be able to find recordings of very interesting and diverse recent talks and performances from our fellows. These are also available on our YouTube channel. If you'd like to know more about some of our formed collections, please search the guides to our collections on our website. Thank you very much for attending, both online and in person. Please join me once again in congratulating Julie Gough for today's very powerful presentation. Thank you, Julie.